The one and only Graham Hancock is back. In addition to a bunch of classic podcast appearances, Graham has his new season of Ancient Apocalypse out on Netflix. I did a couple videos on the first season of Ancient Apocalypse, so go check that out if you haven't. So today we're going to be looking at Graham again, not only his new season of the show, but also some of the criticism he got, some of which is really bad and important. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and let's just jump right in. So before we get into the, controversial part of the video, here's an overview of Season 2. I'm not going to talk about every little thing they do here, so just keep that in mind. I generally think some of my stylistic nitpicks have been addressed in this show from last time. The interviews flow better, the fact that the episodes flow into each other and they're not as just episodic, and sometimes they even end on cliffhangers, makes it a lot more watchable. Graham even got Keanu Reeves on the show, which I think is just pretty cool. In the first episode, Graham does a good job, in my opinion, at laying some of the priming groundwork to get us to accept his theory. At White Sands, New Mexico, Graham discusses the discovery of human footprints that are dated to over 20,000 years ago. This date is about 10,000 years earlier than the Clovis First theory, which was the predominant theory of New World settlement through the 20th century up until about 20 years ago even. And as I talk about in some of my other videos, the efforts by the archaeological community to keep that idea despite mounting evidence against it was very strong, which also goes into Graham's point, and it's covered in the book 1491 by Charles Mann. Nothing Graham talks about here is actually controversial at all, and he kind of waits to introduce his theories, but it opens the door for the idea that archaeology can be revised, usually to earlier dates than initially expected. He then talks about the geoglyphs in the Amazon, once again another non-controversial topic anymore, but once again primes us to be more open to the fact that undiscovered cultures exist. Of course, Graham's theories are much more controversial than the sites he visited in the first episode, and it begins to shine through as the series goes on. For those who don't know, and I made a couple videos talking about this, Graham believes that an advanced, potentially globe-spanning culture existed during the last ice age, and that this culture was destroyed by the Younger Dryas period, which saw massive climate change and sea level rise. Graham believes that various mysterious archaeological sites around the world were actually built by this civilization long before they are believed to have been built by other ancient cultures. He tries to back up this theory by citing peculiar commonalities in global mythologies and architecture, the advanced nature of certain historical monuments that he believes were too complex and or different when compared to their supposedly contemporary architecture, as well as various other factors. In the second episode, Graham focuses a lot on Easter Island. In part, he looks at the fact that studies have shown a significant genetic similarity between the Polynesian people who inhabit Easter Island and the South American natives, coupled with the fact that Polynesians were able to get as far as Easter Island, just out in the middle of nowhere. He uses this to suggest that these parts of the world may have historically been connected, given that this genetic similarity does not appear in Siberia or North America, which was the route that mainline archaeology says humans took to get to the New World. However, I would push back on this one a bit. I think the mainline idea still totally works out. You just need to account for multiple waves of migration, i.e., I think it's a more likely explanation that the common ancestor genetic group of the Polynesians and South Americans crossed Beringia first, and over time other groups came through and displaced them through mainland Asia and North America. A similar process happened in Europe, where Ulrich peoples initially lived in Europe, but they were largely pushed into isolated pockets by Indo-Aryans, hence why we have the Ulrich languages in Europe despite no geographic connection between the places. Graham also speculates that the statues of the island may have pre-existed the Polynesians and that some precursor group had arrived earlier and built them before dying off. Two of his points for this are that the art style has similarities to other old sculptures in the world, including Göbekli Tepe, and that the statues are dated to centuries after the people's arrival rather than soon after, implying some sudden out-of-nowhere-ism that doesn't make sense, and he uses this out-of-nowhere trope a lot. I talk about that again in the first episode. To both of these points, I would though point out that A, cylindrical sculptures are probably some of the easiest types of sculpture to make, hence why they're just common across cultures, and they're very early. And B, it is generally understood that Easter Island didn't have a unified government until centuries after settlement, explaining why the people didn't build these massive statues sooner. It wasn't because they weren't culturally or technologically capable, it's because they didn't have the political organization and access to all the necessary parts of land for it until later. Episode 3 starts on Easter Island again and points out a new study that dates banana trees, which were definitively introduced by humans as far back as 12,000 BC. Many millennia before Easter Island is supposed to have been discovered. This is actually quite an interesting point, and short of some flaw in the data, it could indicate that there was earlier human settlement. However, there's no evidence that this earlier wave would have been more advanced or that they are the ones that built the Moai statues. Graham then focuses on the stone brickwork on the island at the Ahuvanapu site, which sees tightly fitted right-angle blocks, unlike most of the structures on the island. He then travels out to South America to Saskatchewan, did I say that right? Probably not, which also has very large right-angle, hard-cut, perfectly fitting blocks in a fortress wall, which contrasts with its surrounding architecture. This could imply that whoever made these structures were A, the same ones on Easter Island, B, they were somewhat advanced, and C, that they were distinct cultures from the ones generally believed to have built those structures today. Personally, I don't find this one terribly convincing, given that the bricks don't even look the same between Easter Island and Peru, and that the ability to do this wouldn't have been that hard. Graham continues on this point in episode 4, especially regarding the juxtaposition of architecture, but I feel like he glosses over a key point here. There were other cultures in Peru before the Incas, even as recently as 1470, just 20 years before Columbus. It's entirely possible that these other cultures built some of this distinct architecture and that the Incas added to it, and it makes a lot more sense than saying there was some transoceanic advanced Ice Age culture that there's no other evidence of in the world. He does, however, bring up another interesting point regarding a cave where the stone seems to be treated with vitrification or superheated. I am not an expert on thermodynamics and rocks, but from what is presented, this seems to be man-made, and the heat necessary would have been quite impressive to achieve, leading me to think that, yeah, there probably was some advanced system used, but again, I think it's more likely that the Incas or some other recent culture did that rather than this mysterious, uber-old precursor culture. He then pivots back to the Amazon and talks about Gaspar de Carvajal, an early Spanish writer who reported a heavily populated Amazon River area. Initially, he was believed to have been lying, since by the time the next wave of explorers arrived, the area was very sparsely inhabited because of the diseases. But with more recent discovery of Amazonian geoglyphs and sites, it is now believed that Carvajal was actually telling the truth. Again, this is not a controversial statement, and it is accepted by archaeologists today. In episode 5, Graham travels to see the Hopewell Mounds across the US Midwest, and then tries to make the argument that these could be made by the same culture as the Amazonian geoglyphs. Personally, I think this is his dumbest take of the season, since A, dirt mounds are like the easiest kind of structure to build, and B, the styles don't even line up. He just shows a couple of examples which are supposed to be too similar to be a coincidence, and it's just the most innocuous stuff imaginable. Like, one sees a couple of structures with a road coming off of them, and another is a square and circular structure kind of near each other. Not very compelling at all, and I feel like if he had better examples, he would have shown them, but he doesn't. He then travels to the US Southwest, visiting Pueblo culture sites, which are also very cool, but again, don't really further his theory. Finally, Graham visits Palenque in Mexico, where he spends most of the 6th episode as well. Palenque is rife with beautiful architecture, and he spends a lot of time with archaeologist Ed Barnhart, who we'll talk more about a little later. Ed at no point really co-signs Graham's theories, but he is the most engaging guest of the show by far, and he walks Graham through the site and also talks a lot about the Mayan calendar system. Critically, Ed says that there are, quote, very few facts in my field, referring to archaeology, and says a lot of it is theory, which, to some degree is obviously true. Of course, Graham then uses this to put his theories on the same level as mainstream archaeology. He then kind of closes the same way that the other season did, talking about a potentially meteorological disaster, and how the Mayan calendars actually predict something in kind of this early 2000s, 21st century time to be some sort of reset in history, even though, again, he doesn't necessarily take this as some omen. Now, the question you have all been waiting for: do I think Graham is right? No, I do not. If you recall in my first Graham video, I was actually pretty sympathetic to a lot of Graham's ideas, albeit a very watered down version of them. Since then, I've found his arguments less and less convincing, and I think part of that is actually how archaeologists, both professional and amateur, seem to take Graham a bit more seriously and actually engage with his ideas to debunk them. In previous years, when I had tried to find YouTube videos trying to debunk Graham Hancock or just engaging with his ideas in any serious way, I really couldn't find much at all. And I think that Graham kind of whines about this a lot in his stuff. He does have a very valid argument that he is subject to a lot of ad hominem and calls to authority fallacies, and many times people don't actually talk about why his ideas are wrong. They just say he's a dumb pseudoscientific blah blah blah, and it's like, that sounds like you're just losing the argument, you know what I mean? But in the wake of Ancient Apocalypse coming out, there was a slew of content that was actually good that addressed Graham's claims either directly or indirectly. The series that I saw that most definitely changed my mind is by the channel Mini Minuteman, where he really takes a lot of time to debunk some of Graham's most basic points. For example, the Gunung Padang structure in Indonesia that had a secret chamber under it, allegedly, that mountain is actually an extinct volcano, and that chamber is probably a natural magma chamber, not something man-made. The Bimini Road, that beach rock that it's made out of actually manifests in extremely similar ways all over the island, and it's not necessarily man-made as it first looks, and we have examples of all that all over the world, including much more recently formed examples in the Pacific that actually has World War II shrapnel in it, showing that this isn't indicative of a man-made road, but a fast-acting, albeit peculiar, natural process. The Maltese temples all facing towards Sirius at the southeast, well, they also point towards the rising sun, which is probably, for lighting reasons more than anything. I suggest watching the whole series he made for more, but yeah, he does a really good job at adding context to Graham. I would also recommend the channel History for Granite, which doesn't really touch on Graham's ideas much, but he does a lot about the pyramids and ancient Egyptian architecture, and he kind of just either intentionally or otherwise really talks about a lot of stuff that kind of debunks a lot of the ideas that Graham has. But, and this is a big thing, both of these guys, they start their videos not just by shitting on Graham and talking about how stupid he is. It does emerge in the Mini Minuteman series later on, but I think he did something really important by not just being inflammatory to start the episodes. AtunShei Productions makes a good point about the people who like Graham, and he points out that most alternative thinker types aren't bad or stupid, they're just curious people. So when you, as a curious person, watch a YouTube video trying to get a different perspective on Graham, it's a real turnoff when the person just starts talking about how stupid and potentially evil he and his fans are. It's really bad messaging by mainstream historians and archaeologists, and if you just Google Graham Hancock or the series, you're just going to see a whole bunch of really inflammatory stuff that, if you're curious about Graham, you're probably just going to be like, oh, Graham was right, they're after him. It's just not constructive. And I really think that a more measured approach is best. Here is a great example from Ed Barnhart, who featured in that last episode of Season 2, when he went on the Lex Friedman podcast and was asked about Graham Hancock.
I've met Graham, and personally, I like him. He's a nice guy, got a nice sense of humor, and I think he's smart. He's very well read, in fact, better read than a lot of my colleagues. But his conclusions I disagree with. And he and I have talked about this and had a very civil and normal conversation about it and agree to disagree without spitting any venom at any point in the conversation. But I do also try to always remind myself that every paradigm-shifting idea that humans have ever had began as heresy and lunacy. We got to keep our minds open to the things that sound outlandish, because one of them eventually is going to lead us to the big paradigm shift.
See, how hard was that? He was nice. He likes Graham personally. He doesn't say he's a kook. And he acknowledges some of Graham's basic, theories on archaeology, while also pointing out why they're probably just wrong. In short, I don't buy Graham's theories much at all. I think a lot of this is easily debunkable, and this second series is pretty mild, to be fair, so he's not really trying to prove his theory as much. And while I think it did a great job shining a light on the parts of archaeology that are newer and often just not taught in schools or well known, it totally fails at being convincing regarding his Ice Age civilization theory. I think this season presented 2 whole points of evidence that were mildly convincing to me, being the vitrification and the bananas. But there's, of course, still many, many ulterior explanations to these points of evidence, quote unquote. Lastly, I want to look at the most controversial part of Graham, the idea that his theories are racist. There's some variations on this idea, but here's the basic, well-adjusted gist. In the 1800s, many theories began to emerge out of Europe that there were lost ultra-ancient civilizations, or even aliens, that were responsible for some of the world's most famous and ancient architecture and accomplishments. Atlantis was in part an outgrowth of this. These ideas initially began because their progenitors, these European whites, could not accept that non-white groups were able to achieve such incredible accomplishments, and as such they theorized that it actually must have been aliens or a lost white race that did these things. Many of Graham's theories echo these ideas, which were explicitly created out of racism. Now obviously, these ideas took on a life of their own and largely lost their sinister origins. We see this all the time, whether it's ideas or organizations, words, or what have you, that are initially pernicious but become used and totally divorced from their initial pernicious, problematic origins. Obviously, everyone that thinks Atlantis could be real is not a racist. They're in the Bahamas, they have a whole Atlantis-themed resort. Ancient aliens or flat earth or whatever, all that crap. This goes for Graham especially, as noted many times by Graham and his defenders when addressing this, kind of racism point. Graham's theories do not suppose that precursor civilizations were white at all, as that would just be absurd since white people just would not have developed in these areas. Some then try to point to the fact that, well, Graham doesn't question who built the European structures, and those were built by white people, so that shows he questions it only when it's non-white people that make the structures. For example, after their podcast together, archaeologist Flint Dibble quipped that while Graham doesn't believe the Egyptians built the pyramids, he does believe that the Celts built Stonehenge. To that point, I would say, A, Stonehenge is just way less impressive than the pyramids. Like, anyone could have built that. Like, not any culture could have built that. That's not particularly impressive compared to the pyramids. And Graham's argument isn't even that the Egyptians weren't advanced enough to build the pyramids, but that no civilization, even arguably modern Western ones, have been advanced enough to build the pyramids, right? This is not an issue of race or culture. It's just literally like he just doesn't think anyone could have done it. I think that the idea that Graham and his theories are racist is just dumb. I get how people on the outside could think this, just seeing a white guy going around to exotic places and saying, oh, these people couldn't have built this stuff. And I see how understanding the origins of this basic line of reasoning from the 1800s can lead one to believe that as well. But through all of Graham's work, he is extremely reverent of these other cultures. I can of course understand how Easter Islanders would get upset when he says that their ancestors didn't build the Moai and all that. But it's just wrong to say that Graham's motivation or assumption here is racist. Even AtunShei, a pretty progressive history YouTuber, agrees with this point and does not think that Graham is actually racist at all. I don't think Graham's theories are dangerous or anything, or gonna make people white supremacists or anything like that. I think they're just wrong. To some degree, I even have an issue with the labeling of his ideas as pseudo-scientific, although maybe you could convince me on this one. For one, Graham is not, nor has ever claimed to be, an archaeologist, historian, or trained scientific professional of any kind. He is a journalist, he makes that clear. Further, Graham generally, and I say generally because he's not always careful with his words, which is another thing that does him in a lot, he doesn't claim to have proven his theories, and he says that his theories are just that, theories. Here's a clip from the Lex Friedman podcast showing just that.
It's often said that I'm claiming to have proved that there was an advanced lost civilization in the Ice Age, and I am not claiming to have proved that. That is a hypothesis that I am putting forward to answer some of the questions that I have about prehistory.
If we Google the definition of pseudoscience, we get something like something that claims to be scientific but is not in line with the scientific method. Again, Graham does not make this critical first claim. Again, at least canonically, again, he's not always careful with his words, but when he writes, or when he's more composed, yeah, he doesn't really make that claim. So that is it for this video, everyone. Sorry to disappoint all the Graham lovers. Again, I will have those videos I talked about in the description. One about the pyramids, one about just like the general kind of debunking of Graham. I'll put in the Lex Friedman podcast in there as well. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.